The dining room of the Aldercroft Club went quiet the way expensive rooms go quiet. Not all at once, but in a slow ripple, table by table, until the only sound was the string quartet and the particular silence of 80 people pretending not to listen. Margaret Vane set her champagne glass down on the white linen and looked at the man, standing near the service corridor in a suit that was almost right. Almost. The jacket sat a quarter-inch too wide in the shoulder. She had an eye for that. "Mr. Calder," she said, and her voice carried the way voices carry when a woman has spent 40 years making rooms listen to her. "I'll be direct because I've never found indirection useful." She paused. "My daughter deserves someone who can sustain her life, not contribute to it, sustain it. You can't." Across the room, her daughter Paige stood with a glass she was no longer drinking from. She did not look at her mother. She did not look at the man by the service corridor. She looked at the painting above the fireplace, a lake somewhere in the Laurentians, blue-gray and cold, and she kept her face very still the way a person keeps her face still when she has learned that any movement will be used against her. The man by the service corridor, whose name was Jonah Calder, said nothing. He did not stiffen. He did not look around the room to measure how many people had heard. He looked at Margaret Vane with a calm that was not the calm of a man who hadn't understood what she'd said. It was the calm of a man who had already decided that tonight did not require a response. In the inside pocket of the borrowed suit, borrowed from the site supervisor at the Aldercroft renovation project, a man with broader shoulders and a generous nature, there was a folded document Jonah had not yet opened. A courier had handed it to him 3 days earlier in the parking structure off St. Catherine Street. He had put it in his coat. He had not read it. Margaret smiled the smile of a woman who had expected anger and received silence, and had decided silence was the same as retreat. She did not know what was in the pocket. She did not know what she had just done. September arrived in Montreal the way it always did, abruptly, without apology. One morning it was August, and the next morning it was not. And the maple on the corner of the block had gone half red overnight, as if it had been keeping the color in reserve and had simply decided the time had come. Jonah Calder had signed the lease on the Saint-Famille apartment on the 2nd of September. 12 months, paid in advance by bank draft drawn on an account registered in Alberta that no one in Montreal would think to look at twice. The apartment was on the 4th floor of a 1920s walk-up. 2 bedrooms, a cast-iron radiator in the hallway that ticked at night, and a small balcony overlooking an interior courtyard where somebody's bicycle had been locked to the railing all summer and would probably be locked there until spring. His daughter Sorce took the room facing the courtyard because she could see the bicycle. Jonah took the other room. On the 3rd morning, Sorce discovered that the kitchen faucet had a slow drip. She showed him the way a 7-year-old shows you things, by standing beside it in silence until he noticed her noticing it. Jonah looked at the faucet. He said the washer was worn. He said he would fix it. He did not fix it that week. The drip continued, once every 4 seconds, into a pot he set in the sink, and he emptied the pot each morning and told himself the repetition of a small thing could hold a large thing still. The Aldercroft Club sat at the corner of Sherbrooke and a street whose name Jonah had known for years, before he had any reason to walk down it. It was a private club, founded 1888, limestone facade, the kind of building that had always understood itself to be permanent. The Vane family had been members for 3 generations. The renovation scope was significant. The north wing mechanical systems, the heritage staircase restoration, full millwork replacement on the 2nd floor, and a kitchen gut that the previous contractor had started and abandoned. Jonah walked the job site with the departing foreman on a Thursday morning in the 2nd week of September. The man pointed at things with the resigned air of someone who had stopped believing the problems would get fixed. Jonah listened and said very little. He had already read the structural assessment on the plane from Edmonton twice and the engineering addendum once, and had written 3 pages of notes in his own handwriting that he kept in a manila folder in his bag. The project kickoff meeting was the following Monday. He arrived 8 minutes early in a canvas work jacket and the kind of boots that showed real use. He spread the drawings on the table and was reading them when the door opened. Paige Vane walked in alone, no assistant. A leather portfolio under one arm and a coffee she was clearly in the middle of kneading. She was 37. She shook his hand and said his name correctly on the first attempt, which told him something. She introduced herself by her first name and did not offer the vein. He noticed that. He opened the heritage stair drawing to page 4, tapped the baluster detail, and said only, "The original profile isn't documented anywhere in the scope. If we order stock and it doesn't match the existing east stair, we'll be refinishing by hand or replacing twice. I'd like 2 weeks to source a mill that can match from a sample before we demo." Paige looked at the drawing. Then she looked at him. The look lasted 1 beat longer than a contractor's meeting required. Behind him, the door to the hallway opened 3 inches. Sorcy had been sitting in the reception area with a library book and had migrated, as she always did, toward the sound of her father's voice. 1 dark eye and 1 uneven pigtail appeared in the gap. Paige saw her first. She smiled, the uncomplicated kind of smile that costs nothing and means exactly what it appears to mean. Yost saw the smile. He stepped sideways without appearing to and said quietly, "Sorcy, reception, I'll be 15 minutes." Sorcy withdrew. The door closed. Jonah did not look at Paige again until the meeting ended. That evening, on the kitchen table of the St. Famille apartment, with the faucet dripping into the pot and Sorcy asleep with her book still open on the pillow, Jonah took an envelope from his coat pocket and set it on the table and looked at it for a long time. He did not open it. He put it back in the pocket of the work jacket he hung by the door. He stood at the kitchen window and looked at the courtyard below, where the bicycle was still locked to the railing, patient and unconcerned, and he thought about a woman he had not thought about on purpose in 8 months. Her name had been Elspeth. She had grown up 3 blocks from this club, in a townhouse on a street the Vaines would have recognized. She had loved Montreal with the particular loyalty of someone who left it and never stopped belonging to it. She had been 34 when she died, and Sorcy had been 4, and Jonah had been in the middle of something that had no language yet for what it felt like to have a life that had been organized around one person and then wasn't. He had learned the language eventually. He had put it in a drawer. He did not take it out tonight. He turned off the kitchen light and went to bed. 3 weeks into the demolition phase, Jonah spread the subcontractor bids across the kitchen table on a Sunday night. Sorcy had been asleep for 2 hours. He stayed at the table past midnight. By Monday at 5:45 he had a single sheet of cream paper covered in figures in his own hand. The millwork package was 41% above market. The vendor was Renforth Heritage Craft Inc. The principal of Renforth Heritage Craft was a man named Barry Vane, Margaret's younger brother, who had been running a joinery operation out of a converted barn in the eastern townships since the mid-90s. The markup was not hidden. It was simply not discussed. The line item was inside the budget envelope. The previous contractor had signed off without comment. Plenty of people had looked at it and kept walking. Jonah left the annotated page on Paige's desk at the project trailer at 7:10 in the morning, before she arrived. The annotation was precise. 4 comparable restoration projects in Quebec and Ontario, sourced from public procurement records. A cost per linear foot analysis. A note on the relevant section of the Quebec Construction Industry Act governing procurement transparency on heritage restoration contracts receiving provincial heritage designation credit. At the bottom, 2 initials. J.C. Paige read it at 7:52. She read it again at 8:04. She did not call her uncle. She did not call her mother. She sat at her desk for a while and looked at the window and the gray Montreal morning on the other side of it. And then she called the club's legal counsel and asked for a quiet, competitive rebid of the millwork package under standard arm's-length terms. The rebid came in 22% lower. The contract was reissued the following week. Barry Vane called Margaret on a Wednesday afternoon. Margaret listened. She did not call Paige. She opened her laptop and typed a name into a search engine. Jonah called her contractor. The results were thin in the way that careful people's results thin. An Alberta builder's license, in good standing, an incorporated company in Calgary, registered 9 years ago. 1 photograph, a charity dinner for a children's hospital foundation, taken 4 years earlier, in which Jonah wore a dark blazer and stood beside a woman whose face was turned slightly away from the camera, mid-law at something outside the frame. Margaret looked at the photograph for a long time. She picked up the phone and called her assistant. "Find out who he is, all of it. Don't use the club's name." That same Wednesday, Paige passed Jonah on the staircase landing. He was carrying a chalk line. She was carrying the day's site report. They didn't stop walking. She said only, The millwork bids came back clean. He said, "Good to hear." Neither broke stride. But at the top of the stairs, Paige turned and watched him walk down the hallway below. She watched him the way a person watches a door she has been told many times leads nowhere useful. She had been told many things. She had been told she had no head for numbers, until she had demonstrated at 26 that she had a better head for numbers than anyone else in the room. And the room had quietly reorganized itself around a different explanation for why she shouldn't be trusted with authority. She had been told she was too cautious, and then too impulsive, and then too attached to the operations side, and then not attached enough. She had spent 15 years learning to hold the Vane portfolio together with very little acknowledged support and a great deal of unacknowledged competence, and she had done it without complaint, because complaint had always cost more than it returned. And here was a man in work boots who had looked at one column of numbers and done what she had been doing alone for a decade. She did not know who he was outside this building. She only knew that the annotation was correct. She had checked every figure. She had not been the only one looking. The Saturday in the middle of October was the kind of Montreal morning that reminded you why the city was worth the winters. The light came off the St. Lawrence in long, flat pieces, and the leaves were at peak, and the air was cold enough to be worth breathing. Jonah brought Sorsay to the site because she had asked, and because the millwork crew had the weekend off, and because she had, the evening before, produced what could only be described as a formal written request on a piece of paper folded into quarters, which she had slid under the bathroom door while he was brushing his teeth. He let her play in the second-floor reading room, which had been cleared of furniture and was currently the most interesting space she had ever encountered. He sat at the far end of the hall with his clipboard and the slow, exacting work of measuring the cornice profile on a section of original plaster that needed to be matched across 40 linear feet. Paige arrived at 10:20. She had not known the child would be there. She had come because she came most Saturdays, and she had been coming most Saturdays to this building since she was 12 years old, and the second-floor reading room, with its view over the interior garden, had always been the only room in the Aldercroft Club that had never felt like a test. Sorsay was sitting cross-legged in the middle of the empty floor with a sketchpad, drawing the window. Paige sat down on the floor beside her, uninvited but unhesitating, and looked at the window. She asked Sorsay if the window was a good subject. Sorsay said the window had interesting shadows and that she was trying to get the mullions right, but they kept going crooked. Paige said mullions were hard, and she had once failed to draw a straight line for an entire semester in architecture school before accepting that she was better at reading buildings than drawing them. Sawyers looked at her. "You went to architecture school. 2 years. Then I switched to finance." A pause. "This building made me switch. Did you like it more or less after you switched?" Paige considered this with the seriousness it deserved. "More. I understood it differently." Sorsay nodded and went back to the window. After a while, without looking up from her sketchpad, she said, "My mom is in a garden." Paige did not say anything immediately. "Dad says she picked a garden because she said gardens don't pretend to be anything, they just grow." Paige sat with that for a moment. She looked at the window and the sky beyond it and the particular blue that Montreal October gave you for free. "I had a cousin once," she said, "who said something like that. She loved this building the way I think your mom loved gardens. She said it was honest architecture, that it didn't try to impress you. It just stood." She paused. "She taught me to read a balance sheet when I was 17. We used to sit in the reading room on Sunday mornings, and she would point at the cornice and say it was the only straightforward thing her family had ever built." Sorsay tasted this. Then she said, "What was her name?" "Elspeth." Sorsay wrote the name in small, careful letters in the corner of her sketchpad. Then she went back to the mullions. Down the hall, the plaster cornice section lay unmeasured on the clipboard. Jonah's pencil was resting against it at a slight angle. He was leaning against the wall with his arms at his sides, and his eyes closed, not moving. His daughter was talking to a stranger about her dead mother, and the stranger was describing a woman she had loved, who had also loved this building. And the two women were not the same woman, but they had used almost the same words. He pressed the back of his head lightly against the plaster and breathed. It took him 4 minutes to pick the pencil back up. He came down the hall 10 minutes later, with the clipboard under his arm. and his footsteps quiet on the uncarpeted floor. Sorsa ran to him. Paige stood. She looked at him with the look of a person recalibrating something. He looked back. Neither of them said anything right away. Then Paige said, "She said gardens don't pretend." Jonah's jaw moved once. "That sounds right." That was all. Sorsa pulled him by the hand to show him the mullion problem, and the unnamed thing between the two adults was folded carefully away, not gone, just set to one side, because 7-year-olds have their own gravity, and it is usually the correct kind. Margaret returned from Toronto on the 6th of November, in the particular mood of a woman who has spent 3 days being contradicted by people who had not yet earned the right. She had been in meetings with the Aldercrofts' institutional investors about the capital renewal program, and the conversations had not gone as she had wished, and she had come home with the compressed manner of a person reorganizing their dissatisfaction into something productive. The annual Vane Foundation Gala was set for the 21st. Black tie. The Windsor Hotel Ballroom. 250 guests. The Premier's office had confirmed a deputy. 3 major heritage donors who had not renewed in 2 years needed to be brought back, and Margaret had a plan for that, and the plan had a component that Paige had not yet been informed of. On the 12th of November, Margaret's assistant, a woman named Deirdre who had worked for the Vane family for 19 years, and had developed a talent for delivering envelopes with perfect neutrality, came into Paige's office and set a small ivory card on the desk without a word and left. The card was not a request, it was 3 paragraphs. At the gala, Paige would be introduced to Stéphane Beaumont-Girard, the eldest son of the Beaumont-Girard banking family of Westmount. The Beaumont-Girards and the Vans had been allies in a formal business sense for 4 decades, and in a social sense for longer. The introduction had been arranged over dinner with Stéphane's mother in October. Margaret had found Stéphane thoughtful, well-positioned, and appropriately aware of the significance of the families involved. The announcement, not engagement, merely the introduction, though the implication was made legible, would be made tastefully. Deirdre would prepare the room seating. Paige read it twice. She had met Stéphane Beaumont-Girard exactly once, 6 years ago, at a fundraiser for the Museum of Fine Arts, where he had spent 20 minutes telling her about a boat he was thinking of buying, and had not asked her a single question. She walked down the hall to Margaret's office. She closed the door behind her and stood rather than sat. "You didn't ask me." It wasn't a question that needed asking. "Mother, Paige." Margaret looked from her desk with the patience of a woman who had had this conversation many times in many forms and had always won it. The Vane portfolio is at a point that requires stability, not just operationally, visibly. Stéphane is appropriate in every way that matters at this level. He talked about a boat for 20 minutes. He was nervous. People who are nervous talk about boats. I'm not marrying someone because they're nervous about a boat. You're not being asked to marry anyone. You're being asked to sit at a table. Paige opened her mouth. Then she closed it. She had been closing her mouth in this office for 20 years. The movement was automatic, almost comfortable, which was the thing that frightened her most about it. She walked out. She went downstairs and got her coat, and walked out of the Aldercroft without telling anyone where she was going. She drove to west on Sherbrooke, with the windows cracked, and the heater on and the city going past in its November grays, and the first small snow just starting to come down in the way Montreal snow comes. Quietly, as if it had been planning this all along. She drove past the office building on de Maisonneuve, where she had worked for her first 3 years before her mother had called her back to the family operation. She drove past the park, where she used to sit on her lunch hour and eat a sandwich, and think about what she actually wanted, which was the kind of thinking that had a very short shelf life inside the Vane organization. She drove to the Aldercroft Club. She parked on the side street and walked around to the back entrance, which led out onto a small courtyard garden. She sat on the stone step with her coat still on, and her gloves in her lap, and watched the snow come down in the security light. It was 8:50 when she heard footsteps in the alley. Jonah came around the corner with a headlamp that he was not wearing, carrying it in one hand instead, turned off. He had been in the building doing a final walk of the day's millwork installation. He saw her on the step and did not ask any questions. He sat down on the step below hers and set a thermos of coffee on the stone beside her hand. She picked it up, poured a small amount into the cap, drank it, set it back. The snow came down. The security light buzzed once and steadied. 27 minutes passed. Neither of them said anything. When Paige finally stood to go, she rested one hand briefly on his shoulder. Just for a moment. The way a person rests a hand on a railing they trust without having been told the railing is load-bearing. Then she walked down the alley and drove home. Jonah sat on the stone step for another hour. He looked at the snow. He thought about the document in his coat pocket that he still had not read. He took it out. He turned it over in his hands in the security light. He put it back. Not yet. The 21st of November arrived cold and clear. The Windsor Hotel had been managing Montreal's significant evenings for over 100 years and understood what the occasion required. White floral on every surface, a string quartet on the dais, the particular lighting that made everyone in the room look like they had always been exactly as prosperous as they currently appeared to be. Jonah was there as crew. A final punch list item for the electrical installation had required a certified contractor on site for the evening, and the site supervisor had a prior commitment, and Jonah had said he would handle it himself. He wore a dark suit that was his own. He stood near the dimmer panel, by the service corridor, on the east side of the ballroom and watched 250 people conduct the particular performance of privilege that requires an audience to feel complete. At 8:19, Paige crossed the room toward him. She didn't greet him the way you greet someone at a party. She stopped a foot away and looked at the electrical panel he was checking and said, "Thank you for the coffee." "Of course." A beat. "She's doing the introduction tonight." "I know." They stood there in the way two people stand when they are having a different conversation than the one they are technically having. Across the ballroom, Stéphane Beaumont-Girard was making his way from the bar toward Paige with a particular smile. The smile of a man who has been given a favorable briefing and has decided that information constitutes a plan. Paige took a half step back when she registered his approach. She didn't move toward Jonah. She just recalibrated slightly, in a way that most of the room would not notice. Margaret noticed. Margaret excused herself from the donor she was speaking to and crossed to the service corridor. She stood in front of Jonah with a folded check in one hand and the still face of a woman who has made this calculation and found it simple. 3 times your annual billing, Mr. Calder, bank draft. She held it out. You finish the Aldercroft through your crew, by proxy, from wherever you go. You leave Montreal by the end of the week. The Vane family wishes you well in Alberta. Jonah looked at the check. He looked at Margaret. He said, "No, thank you." Margaret's expression changed in a way that was almost invisible. She had expected negotiation, or anger, or gratitude. The calm without any of those was a third thing she was not prepared for. She walked to the center of the room and lifted her glass. The ballroom quieted. "Before we welcome our extraordinary guests this evening," she said, "I need to address something that has concerned me. There are people who misunderstand the nature of rooms like this one." She looked across the room at the service corridor, at Jonah. "You are here to do a job, Mr. Calder. You are not here for anything else. I trust you understand that, and I trust you will not require clarification again." The room processed this in the way rooms process public corrections, with the quick, contained fascination of people who are grateful it is not happening to them. Paige did not look at her mother. She looked at the painting above the fireplace. A lake, the Laurentians, blue-gray and cold. She had seen it 300 times. She had never wanted to walk into it as much as she did right now. Jonah stood by the service corridor and did not move. In his inside pocket the folded document sat unopened, exactly as it had been for 9 days. 4 days after the gala, on the morning of the 25th of November, Jonah received a phone call from a woman named Constance Webb. Constance Webb was 61. She had been a tax and corporate law partner at one of the old St. James Street firms for 22 years. She had attended Elspeth's memorial in Montreal in 2021 at a church on Côte des Neiges that Elspeth had liked for its lack of stained glass, and she had sat near the back and had not spoken to anyone. Jonah had registered a gray coat and white hair near the door and had forgotten both immediately, which he would later understand as a failure of attention he could not afford to repeat. Constance gave him one address, the Aldercroft Club, side door, the committee room on the 2nd floor, and one time, 11 a.m. Tuesday. He arrived at 10:53. Constance was already there, standing at the window with a coffee she had brought herself in a travel mug from a cafe down the street. She turned when he came in and locked the door with a key from her pocket. She set 3 folders on the table. She said, "Sit." She opened the first folder. Calder Holdings LP, registered in Alberta, principal, yourself, through 11 nominee companies across 4 provinces and 1 subsidiary in the Cayman Islands. Current voting interest in Vane Properties Inc. and affiliated entities, 52.4%, acquired in tranches from March of 2018 through September of this year. Jonah said nothing. He had known the number to the second decimal. Constance opened the second folder. Margaret's leverage crisis, spring of 2020. She had executed a margin facility against the family's Class A preferred shares using those shares as collateral. The lockdown had extended the asset downturn longer than her models had projected. By October of that year, she had defaulted on the facility, quietly, through intermediaries. The shares were redeemed and redistributed through a series of numbered companies. 2 of those companies were nominees of Jonah's. She had sold to the man she would later offer 3 times his billing to leave. Jonah looked at the table. He was quiet for a moment. Constance opened the third folder. Board meeting, December 3rd, 9 a.m. Agenda Item 4, Governance Restructuring. The proposal, put forward by Margaret in her capacity as chair, removes Paige Vane from her position as Chief Operating Officer and consolidates all operational authority in the office of the chairwoman, pending a 5-year strategic review. Margaret has the votes, narrowly, among the legacy board directors. She will characterize the move as protecting institutional continuity. She will reference the millwork procurement issue as evidence of Paige's unilateral tendencies. She will reference the gala. Jonah looked at the third folder for a long time. Constance said, "I have known about the board agenda for 7 weeks. I am bound by solicitor-client privilege on my formal mandate with Margaret Vane. I am not bound by any privilege on the work I have done on your behalf, because Margaret does not know I have done it. I have spent 18 months walking a line I would not walk again. I am telling you that now, so that you know what it cost." Jonah looked up. Constance met his eyes. "You can stop it. December 3rd. You can walk into that boardroom, but only if you are ready to stop being Jonah Calder, renovation contractor." He thought about Elspeth. He thought about Sawyers asleep in the room facing the courtyard, her sketchbook on the floor beside the bed, the bicycle locked to the railing outside. He thought about Paige sitting on the stone step in the November snow, not asking him for anything. He nodded once. Constance slid the third folder across the table. "I will see you December 3rd. December 3rd. Jonah rode the elevator to the 14th floor alone. He wore a gray suit, his own, from a tailor on 17th Avenue in Calgary, who worked slowly and well. His shoes were polished. The document from Constance, now open and read many times over, was in his inside breast pocket. The Vane Properties Board met at 9 o'clock. 11 directors, Margaret at the head of the table, Paige to her left in a dark blazer, her hands resting on a closed portfolio, her face arranged in the neutral professional expression she had been perfecting since she was 19. Constance Webb at her usual chair. Second from the corner, Margaret opened without preamble. She moved under the relevant bylaw provision to address a governance matter. Paige's performance was acknowledged. The company was entering a period requiring consolidated leadership. The proposal was to absorb operational responsibility temporarily into the office of the chair. A review period of not less than 5 years. She had the votes, and she knew she had the votes, and the room knew it too. The boardroom door opened. Jonah walked in. He walked in quietly, without looking around, and crossed to the open seat at the far end of the table, the seat that had been vacant since the retirement of the independent director, who had held it for 11 years and had not been replaced because no one had pushed for a replacement. Jonah sat. Paige turned her head. Her breath went in once, sharply, and then was still. Nobody saw it. Margaret looked at him for a moment with the expression of a woman who has decided, "This is a simple problem." "Mr. Calder, the board is in session. This is a closed meeting." Constance stood. She picked up the top folder from the stack beside her and walked it to the end of the table and set it in front of Margaret without ceremony. "Madam Chair," Constance said, "Mr. Calder is the majority shareholder." The room went very still. Margaret opened the folder. 52.4% voting interest. Calder Holdings LP is general partner of 11 nominee companies, each of which had appeared in the share registry as a separate institutional holder, notarized, audited, certified by counsel in 3 jurisdictions. Margaret read the first page. Then the second. Her face did not show shock. Her face showed the expression of a woman who has been reading a map and has just understood that she has been reading it upside down for 5 years. Her hand on the table was the hand that gave her away. The thumb moved against the edge of her portfolio. A small dry motion once, and then controlled. The other directors received their copies. Jonah spoke for the first time. Under Section 9, Article 4 of the company's shareholders' agreement, a majority holder may, by written shareholder resolution, remove the chair and appoint a successor effective immediately. I am exercising that right. He paused. Margaret Vane is removed as chair, effective at the conclusion of this sentence. Paige Vane is appointed chair and chief executive officer, effective immediately. Constance Webb is retained as lead counsel under a revised mandate. The governance restructuring proposal is withdrawn from the agenda. He set a single signed page on the table. Margaret stood. She looked at the page. She looked at Jonah. She looked for just a moment at her daughter. Then she walked out of the boardroom and did not stop walking. Paige remained seated. Her hands were flat on the portfolio in front of her. She did not move for a moment. The room around her was very quiet. Jonah stood, crossed to the door, and left her the chair. She sat at the head of the table in the silence and looked at the window and the gray December sky above Montreal and the first thin snow that was beginning to come down outside. On a Friday evening in the middle of December, Paige parked on St. Famille and sat in the car for 3 minutes before getting out. Sorsay was already in bed. Jonah had told her over dinner, grilled cheese, his standard Friday offering, that someone might come by later. And Sorsay had accepted this information with the characteristic calm of a 7-year-old who had already made up her mind about everything important and was merely waiting for the adults to catch up. Jonah opened the apartment door before Paige knocked. He made tea, Elspeth's brand, a Canadian breakfast blend from a small company in Vancouver that had been her standing order and that Jonah had continued ordering, for reasons he had not examined too closely, for 3 years after she died. He set 2 mugs on the kitchen table and sat across from her and waited. Paige wrapped both hands around her mug. Who was Elspeth to you? Jonah had thought, at various points, about how to answer this question. He had not found a shorter answer than the true one. My wife. The faucet dripped once into the pot. The radiator in the hall ticked. She grew up in this city, he said. She left when she was 27, after a board vote removed her from her position at the company. She had been vice president of operations. Your mother called it a question of cultural fit. The vote was 7-4. Elspeth packed a box, took the elevator down, walked out onto De La Montagne on a Wednesday morning and did not go back. Paige had not moved. I met her 5 months later. She was consulting with a hospitality group in Calgary. We got married in 2015. Sorsay was born in 2016. He paused. Elspeth was diagnosed with ovarian cancer in the spring of 2018. She had 2 years. Another pause, shorter. She died in January of 2021. Paige made a sound that was not a word. She kept working until the end of the first year. She wrote a small collection of essays on built heritage and institutional memory. A press in Halifax published it in the fall of 2021. It's still in print. Small run, green cover, her name in a font she picked herself. He stopped. Paige was looking at him the way a person looks at something that has been in the room the whole time and has only now resolved into the right shape. She named Sorsay on a Sunday afternoon in October of 2015. She had read that the word came from a concept of freedom that you earned rather than were given. He looked at the table. In her last weeks, she asked me one thing. She didn't ask for anything from the company. She didn't ask me to settle any account. She asked me to make sure the company survived into the right hands. She said it had been built, over 60 years, by people who weren't always the people in the photographs. She said the work itself was worth keeping. He stopped. And she said one other thing. Paige waited. She said her cousin Paige was the only person in that building who had ever understood what the company was actually for. She said, when the time comes, Paige will know what to do with it. Give her room. Paige sat very still for a long moment. Then she began to cry, without sound, the way people cry who have been careful with their grief for a very long time and have run out of reasons to keep it contained. She pressed her fist lightly against her mouth. Jonah did not move toward her. He let her have it. She cried for a while, and he sat across the table and looked at the window where the snow was coming down on the courtyard below and he did not look away from her and did not try to shorten what she was feeling. When it finished, she lifted her face. Her eyes were red. She looked at him for a long moment before she asked the question. "Why didn't you do it yourself? You had the votes. You could have taken the chair," he answered without hesitating. "Because Elspeth would have given it to you." Paige closed her eyes. She breathed out slowly, the long, full breath of someone who has been told something they have been waiting to hear, without knowing they were waiting. She opened her eyes. She picked up her mug. She drank. He drank. Outside, the snow came down on the bicycle locked to the railing, patient and unconcerned, and the Montreal night went on around them the way it always had, which is to say without much ceremony, and without any apology, and with exactly enough room for whatever came next. 3 weeks settled into the company the way things settle when authority has been distributed, correctly, not smoothly, not without friction, but with the particular stability of a structure that has been repaired rather than replaced. Paige's first board meeting as chair passed with 7 votes in favor of the stabilization plan. Barry Vane's procurement arrangement through Renforth Heritage Craft was wound down following a quiet review and a negotiated restitution that was not discussed publicly. Margaret was at her house in Palm Beach for the month and had, by all accounts, acquired a new interior decorator and a temporary interest in bridge. The Aldercroft renovation entered its final phase in the week before Christmas. Jonah was on the 3rd floor landing one morning, doing a final inspection of the stair restoration, when Soarse came up behind him with her and announced that she wanted to draw the baluster profile before it got varnished, and she couldn't see the grain anymore. He moved aside and let her work. She drew with the concentration of a child who has decided that the object deserves her full attention, which is the only kind of attention worth giving anything. Jonah stood at the window at the end of the hall and looked at the street below and thought about the lease on the Sainte-Famille apartment, which ran until September, and the Calgary office, which had been running itself well for 3 months and had sent him exactly 2 questions requiring his direct input. And the question of what a person does when the thing they came somewhere to finish is nearly finished. He had not yet decided, which he thought he had a direction. On the Saturday before Christmas, Paige drove to the Aldercroft in jeans and a good coat and walked into the building the way a person walks into a place that belongs to them, not with authority exactly, but with the particular ease of someone who no longer needs to announce themselves. The crew had thinned to 6. The heavy work was done. What remained was the patient kind, hand-rubbing the wood, touching up the ornamental plaster fitting the final hardware, the small investments of attention that take longer than they look and do not photograph well and make everything else possible. Jonah was on the 2nd floor, working on the reading room window frame with a sanding block and the focus of a man who has found the right pace for a thing and intends to keep it. Soarse saw Paige first. She came down the hall at a run, sketch pad in hand, and stopped 2 feet in front of Paige and held up a drawing. Paige took it and unfolded it. 3 figures stood in front of a large building, not accurate architecturally but recognizable in the way that a child's drawing is accurate about the things that matter. One figure was tall with a work jacket. One was medium height with a long coat. One was small with 2 uneven pigtails. In the windows of the building, Soarse had drawn small rectangles of light, each one slightly different, as if she had understood without being told that the point of a window is what it lets through. Paige looked at the drawing for a long time. She did not say thank you. She folded it back along its crease and put it in her coat pocket, carefully, and then she knelt down until she was eye level with Soarse and said, "I'm going to keep this." Soarse studied her face for a moment. Then she said, "I know," and ran back down the hall. Paige stood and found Jonah watching from the reading room doorway. He had stopped sanding some time ago. That evening, after the crew had gone and the building was quiet, they sat on the window sill of the 2nd floor reading room, with the lights off and the city coming through the glass. The salt yellow of the street lights on the snow, the moving red of a taxi, the still blue of the mountain in the distance. Her hand rested on the sill. His hand rested on the sill. 6 inches between them. Neither of them moved. After a while she said, "The club reopens January 10th. There's a small ceremony. I'd like you to be there." He turned and looked at her in the half-dark. "As what?" She was quiet for a moment, not because she didn't know the answer, because she wanted to say it correctly. as someone who stayed. He looked at her. He looked at her the way a person looks at something they have been moving toward for a long time, without entirely knowing that was what they were doing. "We're not planning on going anywhere," she said. She nodded. He nodded. Down the hall, from the room where the sanding block and the drawing and the afternoon's work were all still sitting, exactly where they had been left, they could hear Sayurse singing something to herself, tuneless and unconcerned and thoroughly at home. And the Montreal night held them in the way. Montreal holds people who have decided, without making a formal announcement, to stay.